Hey everybody, happy Monday, and thanks for joining me for the weekly Q&A video. As always, I will just go over a couple of community events and then answer the questions that I either got this week, sort of via DM, or that came up in one of the coaching calls that I thought was important to kind of share with everybody. So in terms of events last week, we had the Value Proposition Mastermind where went over just a different way, a sort of new formula to think about how to evaluate value propositions. And while it's, obviously we talk about this a lot in terms of ourselves, in terms of value propositions to get those executive roles, the concept of value proposition applies to pretty much everything, right? So projects, companies, business, product lines. And so the more you understand what the key levers are, just the more you'll be able to help shape and influence whatever it is you're trying to do. So if you're interested, take a look at that. It is now posted in the community. We also have our next executive meetup this Friday on the 9th. I originally was scheduled to be out, but I'm actually going to be back in time. So I will be there on Friday. So if you get a chance, please join us. And also plug for our book club, which we're going to do Inner Excellence as recommended by Rama on the 23rd. So again, if you get a chance, read the book. If not, it does look actually like an interesting book. I have it. I'm going to start it later today and we'll talk about it. So even if you don't read it, please join because you can always learn something from the book club. Okay, so those are the events. I got one, two, three, four. I got 5 questions for this week. So first one is, do I need specific certifications? Right, and this one comes up all the time in the context of PMP. There's AWS certifications. There's things like CISSP in the security space, and when you think about certifications, right, the basic answer is it all depends on whether the hiring firm requires that as a baseline expectation, right? And the answer is most of them do not. So having a certification is, oh, hey, that person must have gotten certified. Certifications are secondary, though, to actual job experience, right? So if your question is, have you done it? And do you have experience? If you've done it with a good story, that is more valuable than a certification because a lot of times people have certifications, but they haven't really done it, right? A certification is better than having nothing. So that's kind of step one, but step two is actually doing it on the job. The exception being certain jobs, and security jobs are one field that where certifications are usually an entry criteria. Again, I mentioned the CSSP earlier, that's one of them. Uh, Program management is another one. That's almost 50-50 in the sense that some program management organizations really care about basically the PMP. Some don't, some do, but some it is an entry criteria. So when somebody asks about certifications, it is about the knowledge. The knowledge can be very useful. Same concept of an MBA. The knowledge can be very useful, but the certification itself is not as useful as you think. People do not hire because of certifications. It is, it's good to have. It's not negative, but maybe it adds 2 percentage points to your overall value proposition, right? So if it is a job that requires certification, then obviously you need to have that because that is an entry criteria. But don't see certifications as these magic things that convey knowledge. They actually don't if you don't have the work experience to back it up. So just keep that in mind. If it's required, go get it. If not, get the knowledge. If it's easy to do, you might as well have it. But if it costs a lot of money or costs a lot of time, you want to think pretty hard before you go down and get that certification. At least that's my perspective on those. All right, number two, leads. So this is a common one. I don't have much of a network. How do I get started? Right. And ultimately, when we talk about getting leads for roles, that's using your network to flesh out jobs and eventually get recommendations or referrals to those jobs so that you can be kind of first in line. Because the reality is, a lot of jobs are pretty much well decided before they get posted. Right. And so that's the idea of networking is you want to get into the conversation while they're thinking about the job, while they're defining the job, because oftentimes they pick somebody before it's even posted. Right. So you're trying to get in there. So what happens if you really don't have a network? Well, you can't jump right to the end. You can't just call up people and say, hey, do you have a job? Right? It doesn't work. So my recommendation is always start with an interesting topic that you want to learn more about, right? And that can be either something you're already expert in, you want to reach out to peers and say, hey, we've been focused on AI in the financial service industry. This is what I'm doing right now. I see you do something similar. Would love to kind of connect and build my network and see what you think about it, right? So that is kind of a peer related option. Or you can go up and say, either I want to be you someday, like I really like this job, like I'm a director, you're a senior VP in the same field. I'd love to talk to you and just learn about your journey, or I'd love to talk to you and learn about your perspective on Again, AI and financial services for, just picking a random topic. So you do it information based, right? You're trying to get and or share information with somebody else who is either a peer or a more senior person, and that is usually uh, a low ask, meaning there's not a lot of, we talk about the bank account model, like it's not a big withdrawal to say, hey, can you give me some thoughts about this thing? So it's usually pretty easy. It's a nice, easy way to do it. But again, remember, networking is like sales, right? If you reach out to 10 people, you're not supposed to get 10 people to talk to you. You're supposed to get two or three. If you do four or five, that's amazing. Two or three is normal. 1 out of 10 is actually fine, right? This is not a 100% game. It is a sales game, which is you just have to have more at bats and you want to get a couple of people. So if you're new to networking, just reach out and try to have a topic-based conversation with somebody new. And that's the easiest way to get started. So that would be my 2 cents there. Okay, next up, this is sort of sales in the interview process. So this is one that came up earlier this week because a recruiter had explicitly said that they want to do the STAR method. And this person says, well, I know you recommend, meaning me, the lead framework. So we have our own framework right in the community, if you've seen that, which I think is more effective than STAR. But if somebody says, we want you to answer in the STAR format, what do you do? Right. And again, I won't go into the lead because you can look that up in the community. But the main problem with the STAR, situation, task, action, result, if you're not familiar with the STAR model, is that the most important thing in the result is at the end. Right. That's why I personally don't like it, because the most important thing you don't really find out until the end of the story. And so lead, the L is launch with impact, right? So you want to say something about the outcome when you start. But if they've asked for star, you give them star because that's what they want. They're going to get confused if you do it. In that scenario, I would actually use the terms situation, task, action, not so much, and results. So if you answer the question, again, my world, lead with impact. Can you tell me at a time you had a difficult situation with a coworker? And you start with sort of the result or the macro point of value, and you could say something like, sure, we had a challenging launch one time of our new product that actually worked out wonderfully, but yes, there was a challenge in getting up, and I'm happy to tell you what we did to make sure that we got to that, $5 million run rate or whatever we did, right? So that's a value up front. And then you say, so the situation was, and my task was to, I don't think you need to say action because that's kind of implied. So then what I did was, and the result was this. So if they ask you explicitly to use star, my recommendation is to use situation, task, not so much action, and result as the words that you say, because they're basically have a checklist, right? If they're this kind of interviewer where they're like, okay, I'm looking for the star, they're looking for the situation, they're looking for your task, they're looking for the action you took, and they're looking for the result. So to make their job easier, which is a lot of what this mindset is what can you do to make their job easier? Use the words. So here's the situation. Describe the situation. So the task for me was to reconcile and build trust between these two departments. So here's what I did. I went out and whatever you did, and the results were we fixed the problem and we did X, Y, and Z, which, as I mentioned earlier, resulted in successful product launch where we have a $5 million product in this space. Right. So again, if they ask for star, do star, and to make it even easier, use the words that they're expecting to hear. So that'd be my 2 cents around an interviewer that actually asks you very specifically to answer in the star format. Okay. So this was another one around interviews, and this was the idea here. I'm trying to think out of. So basically, I'll just read it to you. Right? It says, you know, this was somebody who said like, I look up and away when I think, and is that bad during interview? So this is the idea of okay, here I've got eye contact right to the camera. And if you ask me a question, I go, well, let me think. And it's a very common thing to do. Visual thinkers tend to look up. This is what they say. A lot of people look to the side, some people look down, but that's a thinking mode, right? And so is it bad to do that during an interview? And what I would sort of turn the question around is, well, do you want them to know you're thinking? Right? And so the idea is it's a tool. If you recognize you do some of these things, you now have the decision point to say, when do I want them to think I'm thinking and when do I not want them to think I'm thinking, and try to match it up. Because again, what we're trying to do, we're trying to solve their problem. We want to show that we can solve their problem. So if I say, tell me about yourself, you should know the answer to that question, right? This is the executive value pitch. We talk about it all the time. You should not be like, well, let me think. I don't know enough about myself, so I'm going to think about myself to figure out what I'm going to say in this moment. right? That is not a good time to be using your thinking mode. You should know that answer, right? You should be looking straight in the camera and be like, well, my name is Drew. This is what I do. Here's my value proposition. And this is why effectively you should hire me, right? Straight on the camera, no thinking required because you know it that well. So, in general, in an interview, you want to focus on the camera because it shows that you know your answers, right? Thinking means you're not sure. Looking at the camera means you know your answer. Now, occasionally, they might throw you something that does require a bit of thinking. So they're like, here's the scenario at our company, right? This is the challenge that we are dealing with internally. They shared new information with you. What would you do in this scenario? And once again, if you have too quick an answer, then it's like pre-planned, but I just gave you new information. So that would actually be a good time to go, well, let me think. So if I understand correctly, you're saying that this is the problem that you have. Okay, well, in that scenario, typically what I would do is X, because you want to sort of acknowledge that you're thinking about the new information they gave you, right? So, yes, sometimes we do this subconsciously, but if you notice this about yourself, you can then use it actively, and it helps convey the mode that you're in. Direct eye contact, I know what I'm talking about, sort of looking away or whatever your default thinking mode is. I'm thinking about it, which again is very appropriate if they're giving you new information and asking you to think about this. Right. So again, turn it into a tool. But in general, if you want the shortest answer is don't do that too often in an interview, right? Interviews are about you knowing your stuff. So most of the time you should know the answer to the question. You should have thought about it and be focused on the camera. Occasionally sort of drifting off to think is fine, but I would try to minimize it as a general rule of thumb in an interview setting. All right. And then last one is in sort of the executive results category. And it says, you know, I think there are important things for me to fix in my group, but my boss is focused on other priorities for me. What do I do? Right. So the scenario is you're like, here's the major problem. And then your boss or somebody else says, but we have to work on this stuff. So what do you do? Because if you work on this stuff, your boss will think you're not focused on the important things, right? That's what happens. Like, you're doing things that you think are really important, but the boss is like, you're not being proactive enough. You're not, aggressive enough. You're not focused on the right priorities. But you're like, no, I am focused on the right priorities. Well, not in their mind because they said this is a priority. If you focus exclusively on that, it's probably hard for yourself because suddenly the things that you think are important are not getting done. And this is where, and again, we've sort of talked about this before, but this idea that there's what you do and then there's what people think you do, right? And they are related but totally different, right? Nobody really knows what you do all day. You're the only person who knows it, but people have a perception of what you do. And so in this case, and this is one of those executive skills, is how do you thread this needle? How do you sort of do both, right? At least to a certain extent. And the basic idea is, as far as your boss is concerned, you're working on the things that your boss thinks that are important, right? So you need to put a certain amount of focus on those things because if you don't, they're going to think that you're just focused on the wrong things, right? And you're like, no, no, but this stuff's really important. Doesn't matter if they have a different opinion. You can try to change their opinion, but if they have a different opinion, you need to focus on what they think is important, even if you think it's not the most valuable thing. So you need to focus on that. And when you talk to your boss, you talk to your boss about the things that are important. You then often do the things that you think are important, right? But you don't talk about it as much to your boss, or you make it sound much easier than it is because that's not where you're supposed to be spending your time, even though you know that's kind of where you need to spend your time. And that's this idea of, and it's a very much a skill set that you need at the executive level is here's what I do, here's what people think I do. You need to manage them separately. The things that you do are the things that you feel are important. But the reality is, certain things that you think are important are not going to resonate with executives. People are not going to think they're as important as you. And there are other things that you're like, this is kind of silly or this is super easy. But like if you do it, it gets a lot of attention from the executives. Right. And so you need to sort of think about them as two related things, balance your time. And again, it's sort of 20-80, maybe what you do, 80% on what you think is important, 20% on what your boss thinks is important. But when you talk to your boss, 80% is on the stuff that they think is important, and then 20% is on the stuff that you think is important, right? That's kind of an extreme scenario, but that's the balance that you need to get into is they are two separate conversations. Only you know what you do every day. You need to spend your time in the way you think is most valuable. But when it comes to your boss or anybody else, they have their priorities. And the only thing that they care about is are my priorities being advanced, right? Same thing when we talk about interviews. right? It's not about you, it's about the problem you solve. You might have all these wonderful skills, but if they're not applicable to this problem, the interviewer doesn't care, right? That's the mindset, right? Everybody has a focus on what is important to them. So, same thing with your boss or whoever, any executive, they have their priorities. And when you're with them, when you're focused on them, you want to be focused on solving their problem, which means talking about the things that matter to them, right? So again, I know this one's a tricky one and it takes a little while to get the balance right, but the first step is to recognize that they are two separate things that need to be managed differently, right? What you do, what people think you do, two separate concepts. So again, that one will take a little practice to get, but that is ultimately what you need to do, particularly at the executive level, because they are related but two different things. Okay. There you go. So those are the questions I had for this week. So as always, if you have questions, just drop me a DM in the community. You can put a question at the end of this post. Otherwise, I will see you in there and we'll do it again next week. All right. Have a great week, everybody. Take care.